Texas, June 1944. Scorching heat, metal chains. 12 German women stood on a train platform in air so thick it felt solid. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and showed no mercy. Sweat ran down faces that had forgotten what comfort felt like. Dust coated dry mouths. Fear tasted like copper on tongues that had stopped forming words 3 days ago. They wore chains. 4 women connected to 4 women connected to 4 women. The metal had carved grooves into their wrists over 3 weeks of constant wear. Not deep grooves, but visible. Red marks that throbbed with every heartbeat. The chains clinked with every breath, every shift of weight, every unconscious movement that forgot about the metal binding them together. 5 words would haunt these 12 women for the rest of their lives. 5 words spoken by a Texas cowboy that would destroy everything they believed about American cruelty. 5 words that would prove humanity was stronger than war, stronger than propaganda, stronger than the hatred that had consumed the world. The chains hit the concrete floor. The sound echoed like thunder, like the crack of lightning splitting the sky, like the sound of freedom arriving when freedom seemed impossible. But that moment came later. First, there was the heat, there was the fear, there was the absolute certainty that what waited for them in the burning Texas wasteland would be worse than anything they had imagined. They were wrong. Margaret Hoffman stood chained between 2 other women, her radio operator's eyes scanning everything with practiced precision. 24 years old, Berlin-born, trained to intercept Allied communications, to sit for hours in front of equipment that hummed and crackled, with voices speaking languages she had learned to understand but never learned to hate, until the voices stopped. Until the war came for her not as an operator, but as a prisoner. The chains connected her left wrist to Anna Weber's right wrist. Anna, 28, a schoolteacher from Munich, who had taught children about German greatness until the bombs started falling on schools. Her lips moved in silent prayer. A rosary hid in her dress, pocket contraband, she risked punishment to keep. The weight of guilt sat on her shoulders heavier than any chain. She had believed. She had taught others to believe. Now she wore the consequences. Maggie's right wrist connected to Greta Mueller's left. Greta, 22, a farmer's daughter from Bavaria, whose hands knew the feeling of soil and livestock better than they knew the feeling of freedom. She scanned the Texas horizon looking for something familiar. The landscape reminded her too much of home. Flat fields, distant cattle, sky that went on forever. The similarity hurt worse than the differences would have. 3 women, 3 stories, 3 transformations waiting to happen. But in that moment on the platform, they were just prisoners, just enemies, just Germans who expected torture because that's what the propaganda had promised. That's what the guards on the ship had implied with their silences. That's what the chains suggested with every clink of metal on metal. Camp Hearn sprawled before them in the brutal morning light. Row after row of wooden barracks, guard towers built from raw lumber, wire fences gleaming in the sun like warnings written in steel. The camp was new, still being finished. Hammers rang in the distance. Dust hung in the still air. Nearly 4,000 prisoners were held here. Most were men. Afrika Korps soldiers captured in North Africa, their desert tans fading in Texas heat that felt different than Saharan heat, but burned just as fierce. One section had been set aside for approximately 100 German women gathered from various captures across Europe and brought here for what the Americans called administrative efficiency. The train doors had opened at 8 in the morning. The sun was already vicious, already promising a day that would test the limits of human endurance. The women shuffled from the train, still chained 4x4, shuffled into the processing building, shuffled through the machinery of becoming official prisoners of war. Photographs, flash bulbs popping, the chemical smell of developing fluid sharp in enclosed spaces, fingerprints, ink cold and sticky on fingers that would carry the stains for days no matter how hard they scrubbed. Numbers assigned, names recorded, identity reduced to data points and ledgers that would outlast the war, outlast the hatred, outlast everything except the memories of the people who lived through this transformation. Then came clothes. Simple cotton dresses in drab colors probably donated by American civilians. Women who had never met these prisoners. Women who had looked at their closets and decided that enemy soldiers were still human beings who needed clothes. The gesture confused Maggie more than cruelty would have. Cruelty made sense. Kindness from enemies created questions that had no easy answers. The sizes were wrong. American women were built differently. The dresses hung loose on European frames, making the prisoners look smaller than they were, making them look like children playing dress-up, making them look vulnerable in ways that military uniforms had prevented. Anna touched the fabric quality and felt her shame intensify. This cotton was better than what German civilians were wearing now, better than what her students' mothers had worn in the final months before the schools closed forever. Through all of this, through every photograph and fingerprint and number and dress, the chains remained. Maggie had worn them for 3 weeks now. From France to ship to America to Texas. The metal had become normal. She had learned to sleep despite the constant clinking. Learned to sleep despite Anna's quiet crying on her left. Learned to sleep despite Greta's restless movements on her right. The chains had become an extension of her body. She moved with them, breathed with them, existed with them as fact rather than punishment, until she met Sam Harrison. Then everything changed. Sam Harrison was 59 years old, owner of a cattle ranch southwest of Camp Hearn, 5,000 acres of pasture that needed tending, cattle that needed care, fences that needed constant repair, a legacy that needed protecting. The war had taken most of his ranch hands. Young men shipped overseas or pulled into defense factories where wages ran higher than what a cattle ranch could pay. His operation was bleeding workers, bleeding efficiency, bleeding the possibility of survival if something didn't change soon. He needed 12 workers. The commandant had plenty, but there was one problem that would define everything that came after. The women were chained. Harrison stood in the camp's main administrative building wearing clothes that spoke of decades working land that didn't forgive weakness. Denim jeans worn soft from use, leather boots that had walked thousands of miles across pasture, a shirt with pearl snap buttons, practical for quick changes when weather turned, a hat faded by years of Texas sun to a color that had no name except used. His face was weathered like old wood left outside to cure. His hands were calloused in patterns that told stories of rope and tools and livestock that didn't care about human convenience. He looked at the 12 chained women with an expression Maggie couldn't read. Something between assessment and anger. Something between calculation and moral outrage. His jaw tightened. That was the only visible sign of what he felt looking at metal restraints on human beings who would be working with his animals. Beside him stood Otto Brenner, 45 years old, German-American from Fredericksburg, Texas, a town built by German immigrants who had come to Texas before wars made that heritage complicated. Otto had grown up speaking 2 languages. German at home with parents who never lost their accents. English everywhere else spoken with a Texas drawl that marked him as native despite his foreign surname. He served as interpreter now, bridge between worlds, living proof that German blood didn't automatically mean German loyalty. Harrison spoke. Otto translated. The commandant listened with the expression of a man who had heard civilian complaints before and knew how this conversation would end. These women will work at my ranch, farm work, livestock care, daily transport from camp, return each evening. Pay deposited to camp accounts per Geneva Convention requirements. Standard arrangement. The commandant nodded. Routine paperwork. Routine labor contract. Nothing unusual except for one detail that Harrison's eyes kept returning to like a wound he couldn't stop touching. The chains. Harrison kept looking at them, at the red marks on wrists, at 4 women linked together like criminals. His jaw tightened further. Then he said something sharp in English. Direct, no politeness softening the edges. Directed at the commandant with the force of a man who had made a decision and wouldn't be moved from it. Otto hesitated before translating, then spoke the words in German carefully as if uncertain he had heard correctly. Mr. Harrison wants to know why they're still chained. Security protocol, the commandant replied stiffly. Standard procedure. They're enemy military personnel, trained operatives, potentially dangerous. The regulations are clear. Harrison's response was longer, harder. His tone left no room for argument. Each word landed like a hammer on metal. Otto translated carefully, preserving the intensity even as he softened the Texas bluntness into German formality. Mr. Harrison says chains are dangerous around livestock, could catch on equipment, could cause injury to workers and animals, could spook horses, could tangle in machinery. He says he won't take them chained, says if they're too dangerous to unchain, they're too dangerous for ranch work, and he'll find other labor. Silence filled the room like smoke, heavy, choking, impossible to ignore. Maggie watched this exchange with her operator's attention to detail. This American man, this cowboy who owned land and cattle and buildings, was arguing with a military commandant, arguing for German prisoners, arguing that chains were wrong not because of morality, but because of practicality. The distinction mattered. Moral arguments could be dismissed as sentiment. Practical arguments had to be addressed as fact. The commandant's face showed he had fought this battle before. Civilian contractors had leverage in 1944. The labor shortage was real, desperate, critical to the American home front economy. Ranches needed workers, farms needed workers, factories needed workers. The prisoners provided a solution to an unsolvable problem, but only if the civilians would take them. Only if men like Harrison would sign the contracts and accept the liability and deal with the complications. Harrison clearly wasn't bluffing. His stance, his tone, his absolute certainty. This man would walk away from 12 workers rather than accept them in chains, would let his ranch suffer rather than compromise on this point. The commandant made his calculation, weighed regulations against reality, weighed protocol against practicality, made his decision. Remove the chains. Maggie's heart stopped. Anna's breath caught. Greta's eyes went wide. Around them, the other 9 women froze in postures of disbelief. Guards stood straighter. Otto's voice carried surprise, even through professional translation. The commandant's order hung in the air like something fragile that might shatter if anyone moved too quickly. A guard approached with keys. The sound of his boots on concrete was too loud. Everything was too loud. The keys rattled, metal on metal, the sound Maggie had heard in nightmares. The sound that preceded changes. Sometimes good changes, usually bad ones. The guard knelt beside the first group of 4 women, found the lock connecting Maggie to Anna, inserted the key, turned it. Click. The sound was impossibly loud in the silent room. Louder than it should have been. Louder than physics allowed. The mechanism released. The connection broke. The chain that had bound Maggie's left wrist to Anna's right wrist for 3 weeks fell away. Another click. Maggie's right wrist released from Greta's left. Another click. The internal connections within each group of 4. Click, click, click. Each lock opening sounded like freedom arriving one small mechanism at a time. Then the chains hit the floor. The sound crashed through the room like thunder. Like the end of the world. Like the beginning of something new that had no name yet because it was too unexpected to have a vocabulary. Metal struck concrete and echoed and echoed and echoed. 12 chains falling, 12 thunderclaps, 12 announcements that something impossible was happening. Maggie stared at her wrists. The grooves were still there, red, sore, strange marks on skin that had forgotten what bare air felt like. But no chain connected her to anyone. No metal limited her movement. No weight pulled her back when she tried to lift her arm. She lifted her arms experimentally, slowly, testing whether this was real or hallucination brought on by heat and fear and hope that had become toxic. Her arms rose. Nothing stopped them. Nothing pulled her back. She could raise them above her head, could stretch, could move independently of the 3 other women she had been bound to for 21 days. Freedom felt wrong, too light, too empty. Her body expected resistance that didn't come, expected weight that had vanished. Her wrists felt naked, exposed, vulnerable in ways that chained wrists had never felt vulnerable. Around her, other women touched their wrists gently. Some stood frozen, overwhelmed by the absence of what they had grown accustomed to. Katrine Schmidt, 26 and pregnant, cried silent tears she quickly wiped away, as if ashamed of showing emotion in front of guards. Anna's hands trembled. Greta flexed her strong farmer's hands, testing their new independence, allowing herself the first smile Maggie had seen on her face in 3 weeks. Harrison stepped forward, spoke through Otto. His words came slowly, deliberately, each sentence given space to land before the next one began. You'll work hard. We'll treat you fair. Simple statement, simple promise, nothing elaborate. Nothing that sounded like propaganda or manipulation. Just basic terms of employment, spoken as if employment was possible between a Texas rancher and German prisoners of war. You need something, you tell the foreman. You have problems, you report them. That's the deal. He paused, looked each woman in the eye. Direct eye contact, no shame in it, no hatred, just assessment, measuring what he saw, deciding whether this gamble would work or destroy everything he had built. Then he added the words that would echo in Maggie's mind for 54 years. And you won't need chains here. Not on my ranch. Your people first, prisoners second. Otto's voice wavered slightly, translating that last part. Uncertain he had heard correctly. Uncertain whether the German words he chose carried the same revolutionary weight as the English ones Harrison had spoken. People first, prisoners second. Menschen zuerst, Gefangene zweitens. The words hung in the Texas heat like something sacred, like a promise, like a threat to everything the war had taught them about enemies and identity and the unbridgeable distance between us and them. Maggie felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, open. A space creating itself where only certainty had existed before. The certainty that Americans would be cruel. The certainty that enemies stayed enemies. The certainty that chains defined prisoners and prisoners deserved chains. Harrison had removed those certainties as easily as he had removed the metal. 5 words. You won't need these here. 5 words that suggested the rules could be different, that people could choose dignity over degradation, that even in war, even between enemies, even in circumstances designed to dehumanize someone, could decide that chains were unnecessary. People first, prisoners second. Maggie tested the words in her mind, tried them in different contexts, applied them to herself. Margaret Hoffman, person first, radio operator second, German third, prisoner fourth, woman fifth, enemy sixth. The order mattered. The priority mattered. If she was a person first, then everything else became context rather than definition. The implications terrified her more than the chains ever had. This is one of the most incredible untold stories from World War II. If you love stories like this, stories schools never taught you, stories that prove humanity exists even in war, hit that subscribe button right now. Tap the bell icon so you never miss another hidden piece of history. Drop a like if you want more true stories about the values that make America exceptional. What you're about to witness isn't propaganda. This is documented history. Real names, real places, real transformation. You'll see how a Texas cowboy's 5 simple words destroyed decades of Nazi propaganda in 30 seconds. You'll discover why German women who expected torture broke down crying over American lemonade. You'll understand why this story hidden for decades matters more today than ever before. But before we get to what happened on Harrison's ranch, before we see how these women transformed from chained prisoners into skilled workers, you need to understand who Sam Harrison was. You need to know why a 59-year-old Texas rancher would risk everything to remove those chains. You need to see the man who decided that people were people first, even when the world said they were enemies. Sam Harrison had owned his ranch for 34 years, inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father, who had claimed it from raw Texas prairie when Texas was still young and wild. 5,000 acres, not the biggest ranch in Texas, not even the biggest ranch in the county, but his, worked by his hands, built by his decisions, sustained by his refusal to quit when drought came or cattle prices dropped or the bank suggested selling. He had lost his wife Ruth 5 years ago. No, that wasn't right. Ruth was still alive, still ran the household, still made decisions about the ranch with the authority of someone who had worked this land as long as her husband, 55 years old. Practical, kind in a way that never wasted words or gestures. She would be the one who brought lemonade to German prisoners and changed everything without knowing she was changing anything. Harrison's philosophy was simple. Judge people by their work, not their uniforms. He had learned this from Mexican ranch hands who had taught him about cattle and horses and land management when he was young and stupid and thought being American made him superior. They had been patient with his ignorance, had taught him that respect earned respect, that competence transcended nationality, that a man who could affix a fence or gentle a horse or read weather and cloud formations had value regardless of where he was born or what language he spoke at home. The war had taken his ranch hands. The young ones enlisted or got drafted, shipped overseas to fight in places whose names Harrison couldn't pronounce. The middle-aged ones took jobs in defense factories where wages ran 3 times what a ranch could pay. He was left with men in their 60s who worked hard but couldn't do everything, and boys in their teens who tried hard but didn't know everything. His 5,000 acres were bleeding productivity. Cattle weren't being moved to proper pasture. Fences weren't being repaired before they failed completely. The vegetable garden that fed the household and supplied the town market was getting smaller because nobody had time to maintain it properly. He needed workers desperately. The Geneva Convention said prisoners of war could work if treated according to international standards, paid fairly, fed adequately, housed appropriately, not forced into military production or anything that directly supported the war against their home countries. Agricultural work qualified, ranch work qualified. Fixing fences and feeding cattle and growing vegetables didn't violate any treaties. Harrison had gone to Camp Hearn to negotiate a contract. He needed 12 workers. The commandant had hundreds. The math should have been simple, except for the chains. Harrison had been around livestock his whole life, 50 years working with cattle and horses and animals that could kill you if you weren't careful. He knew what chains did to animals and to people. He knew chains created fear, not cooperation. Chains broke spirits. Chains made workers defensive and resentful and dangerous in ways that free workers never were. He also knew something the commandant didn't know, something the war hadn't taught most people, something that seemed radical in 1944 but was actually ancient wisdom that every generation had to relearn at terrible cost. Enemies were just people wearing different uniforms. People responded to dignity, not degradation. Treating someone like an animal made them act like an animal. Treating someone like a person made them act like a person. The choice wasn't complicated, the implementation was. When Harrison walked into that administrative building and saw 12 German women chained together like criminals headed for execution, his jaw had tightened. Not from hatred, from recognition. He had seen animals chained that way, had seen the damage it did to their spirits, had seen how they stopped trusting, stopped cooperating, stopped being anything except afraid. His decision in the next 60 seconds would change 12 lives forever, would create ripples that would spread through decades, would prove something that war tried to disprove every single day. That kindness wasn't weakness. That dignity produced better results than degradation. That chains were never necessary for people doing honest work. But his decision would also create a problem named William Barnes. Sergeant William Barnes, who stood in the corner of that administrative building, watching Harrison argue for removing the chains. Barnes, who had lost his brother Tom at Normandy Beach 3 weeks ago. German machine gun, 23 years old. Dead before he understood what was killing him. Barnes believed every German deserved to suffer. Believed chains were merciful compared to what Germans deserved. Believed Harrison's kindness was dangerous weakness that would get Americans killed. He was wrong, but he was certain. And certain men with notebooks and cameras and access to inspector generals could cause damage that took months to undo. Barnes watched the chains fall. Watched Harrison speak his revolutionary words about people first and prisoners second. Watched the women's faces transform from fear to confusion to something that might have been hope if hope was allowed to exist in prisoner of war camps. Barnes reached for his notebook, started documenting what he saw as violations, security risks, dangerous fraternization, evidence that would build into a report that would trigger an investigation that would threaten to destroy everything. But that came later. In the moment when the chains hit the floor, there was only the sound of metal on concrete echoing through a room that had just witnessed something rare, a choice for dignity over fear, a bet that people were people first even when the world insisted they were enemies. Maggie lay in her bunk that night, unable to sleep. She was alone for the first time in weeks, unchained, able to move freely, able to turn over without pulling Anna and Greta with her, able to stretch her arms above her head, able to shift positions without the constant clink of metal reminding her of her status. Freedom felt too strange to enjoy. Her wrists still throbbed where the grooves had formed. Her body still expected resistance when she moved. Her mind still cataloged herself as chained prisoner, even though the physical evidence said otherwise. What if this was temporary? What if tomorrow they put the chains back? What if this cowboy was playing some game she didn't understand? What if kindness from enemies was more dangerous than cruelty? Because at least cruelty was predictable. Anna whispered from the next bunk. Do you think he meant it? Which part? Greta's voice came from the darkness. Maggie answered slowly, testing the words as she spoke them. People first. Do you think he actually believes that silence filled the barracks? Other women breathing? Some sleeping? Some lying awake with the same questions that had no easy answers. I want to believe it, Greta finally said. Her voice carried longing that hurt to hear. I want to believe that somewhere in this war, there's a place where nationality doesn't matter, where work is just work and people are just people. But believing it feels dangerous, Anna whispered. Feels like setting ourselves up for worse pain when it gets taken away. Maggie considered this. Considered the radio operator's need for logic and evidence and proof before accepting any transmission as legitimate. But she also considered the feeling of chains falling away, the sound of metal hitting concrete, the absence of weight that had defined her existence for 3 weeks. Maybe believing it is less dangerous than expecting cruelty, she said finally. Maybe hope is the practical choice when the alternative is assuming the worst and being surprised when something better arrives. No one answered, but Maggie felt them thinking, felt them reconsidering their expectations, felt them testing the possibility that this Texas ranch might be different than every other place they had been since the war turned them from citizens into prisoners. Tomorrow they would discover whether Harrison's words matched his actions. Tomorrow they would ride 12 miles southwest to 5,000 acres of pasture that needed working. Tomorrow they would find out if chains had truly been removed or if they had just been replaced with invisible ones that bound through fear instead of metal. Tomorrow would prove whether people first and prisoners second was real or just another kind of propaganda spoken with a Texas accent instead of a German one. But tonight, Maggie touched her bare wrists and felt the grooves that would fade over weeks, felt the absence of metal that had seemed permanent until a cowboy with bolt cutters decided it wasn't, felt the possibility that everything she had believed about enemies might be incomplete. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Failed. Lay awake listening to Anna's breathing and Greta's restlessness and the sound of her own heartbeat that seemed too loud in the absence of chains clinking their constant rhythm. Freedom felt terrifying. Freedom felt impossible. Freedom felt like something that could be taken away as easily as it had been given. But for tonight, for these hours between sunset and sunrise, Margaret Hoffman was unchained, was a person first, was someone who might work on a ranch tomorrow without metal binding her wrists. The transformation had begun. She didn't know it yet, couldn't see it yet, but the crack in her certainty had formed. The possibility had taken root. The chain had fallen, not just from her wrists, but from her understanding of what was possible between enemies in wartime. Tomorrow would test whether that possibility could survive contact with reality. Tomorrow would show whether Harrison's ranch was different or just another place where Germans remained enemies, no matter what words were spoken about people first. Tomorrow would reveal whether 5 words could actually change everything or whether hope was just another kind of chain that bound tighter for being invisible. Monday morning arrived hot and bright. Dawn broke over Camp Hearn at 5:30, the sun already promising brutality by the time it cleared the horizon. 12 German women climbed into the back of a military truck, moving with the careful uncertainty of people testing new realities. No chains connected them, just air and possibility and the weight of questions about whether yesterday's freedom would survive today's light. 2 guards sat with them, rifles held casually across laps. The guards looked bored rather than alert. One was reading a newspaper. The other smoked a cigarette and watched the landscape roll past with the glazed expression of someone who had made this trip too many times to find it interesting anymore. Neither guard seemed concerned that 12 unchained enemy prisoners sat within arm's reach. Maggie noted this with her operator's precision. If the Americans truly believed they were dangerous, the guards would be tense, watchful, ready. Instead, they looked like workers heading to jobs they neither loved nor hated, just routine. Just another Monday transporting prisoners to labor contracts. The truck rumbled southwest through flat Texas landscape, that went on forever in every direction. Endless sky turning from pink to blue to the harsh white that promised heat. Scattered mesquite trees dotted pastures where cattle grazed like toys in the distance. Barbed wire fences ran to horizons separating land into parcels that human beings had claimed and marked and defended. The smell hit first. Dust and cattle and hay and something green and growing. Something that spoke of life continuing despite war, despite hatred, despite the entire world trying to destroy itself thousands of miles away. Texas smelled different than Germany. Drier, hotter, but also familiar in the way all agricultural land smelled familiar. Dirt doing the work of sustaining the living. Greta pressed her face close to the truck's side slats, breathing it in. This looked like home, too much like the farm she had left. Bavaria had rolling hills where Texas had flat plains. Bavaria had wheat fields where Texas had cattle pastures. But the essential truth was the same. Land that needed working. Animals that needed caring. The rhythm of seasons that paid no attention to human conflicts. Homesickness hit her like a fist to the chest. Physical pain spreading from her heart outward. Her family's farm was destroyed now. The Red Cross letter had been clear about that. Bombed, burned. Her father killed trying to save the livestock. Her mother and sisters, missing status unknown, probably dead, but maybe alive in some refugee camp somewhere filing paperwork that would take years to process. She had nothing to go back to. This ranch spreading across the Texas horizon might be the closest thing to home she would ever have again. The thought made her want to cry and felt like betrayal simultaneously. Anna sat with her eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. She was asking God for guidance about whether working for the enemy made her a traitor or whether survival was its own kind of loyalty to the Germany that had existed before the war destroyed it. The theological questions had no easy answers. Her faith said to submit to authority. But which authority? The Reich that had sent her to this prison, the Americans who had removed her chains, the God who seemed absent from a world that had forgotten how to be merciful. She opened her eyes and watched the landscape pass. Everything here served a purpose. No ornamental gardens, no decorative landscaping, just functional buildings and working animals and land used for production. Honest work supporting honest living. Maybe that was answer enough. Maybe the morality of work existed independent of the politics that created the circumstances requiring it. Maggie calculated distances and assessed terrain with the part of her mind that never stopped analyzing tactical information. 12 miles from Camp Hearn to Harrison Ranch, approximately 19 kilometers. The truck traveled perhaps 30 miles per hour on these dirt roads, 48 kilometers per hour. The math grounded her. Numbers were reliable when everything else felt uncertain. If they wanted to escape, this would be the moment. 2 board guards, open country in every direction. 12 women against 2 men. The odds weren't terrible, but escape to where they were in the middle of Texas. Foreign country, foreign language most of them barely spoke. No money, no resources, no plan beyond running. And why would we run? The thought surprised her with its clarity. We're unchained. We're being treated fairly. We're heading to work that pays wages instead of camps that offer nothing except waiting for war to end. The realization felt like treason. She was German. These were enemies. The Reich had trained her to resist, to escape if possible, to never cooperate beyond the minimum required. But the Reich had also promised that Americans would torture prisoners, would starve them, would treat them with the same brutality that German camps presumably showed Allied prisoners. The chains coming off had broken that promise, had created cracks in every other promise the Reich had made. If Americans could choose dignity over degradation, what else might be different than the propaganda claimed? The truck slowed, turned onto a narrower road. Dust clouds rose behind them, marking their passage across land that looked wild, but was actually carefully managed. Every fence line served a purpose. Every pasture rotation followed a plan. The wilderness was an illusion created by scale. Humans controlled this landscape as thoroughly as they controlled the camps and cities and battlefields, just more subtly. Harrison Ranch appeared in the distance. White clapboard main house with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Ancient oak trees provided the only shade for miles, their branches spreading like natural architecture. Red-painted barns with wood silvered by decades of sun and wind. Corrals where cattle already moved in the morning light, their bodies creating dust that caught the sun and glowed gold. Windmills turned slowly in the morning breeze. The sound of their mechanisms reached the truck before the visual details sharpened. Rhythmic creaking, metal on metal, gears and chains and pumps bringing water from deep underground to the surface where life could use it. The sound was hypnotic, ancient, the sound of human ingenuity solving the eternal problem of thirst in dry land. The vastness struck all 12 women simultaneously. 5,000 acres, 8 square miles, 12.8 square kilometers. Land stretching to every horizon with nothing to mark its boundaries except fence lines too distant to see clearly. This was one man's ranch, one family's legacy. The scale made German farms look like gardens. Sam Harrison met them in the yard wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Denim jeans, worn leather boots, pearl snap shirt, faded hat. He didn't dress differently for the first day of a new labor crew. Didn't stage anything. Just stood beside a fence he was repairing, hammer in hand, nails in his mouth, working before the women arrived because work didn't wait for ceremonies. He removed his hat when the truck stopped. Simple gesture of respect. Nodded a greeting that required no translation. "Morning, ladies." His voice carried the slow Texas drawl that made every word seem considered. Deliberate. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. Just basic communication from someone who measured words the way he measured fence posts, using only what was necessary to get the job done right. Beside him stood Frank Delgado, 52 years old, foreman who had worked this ranch for 30 years longer than some of the women had been alive. Lean body weathered by outdoor work. Mexican Texan heritage evident in his features and his accent that blended Spanish and English into something distinctly regional. His eyes assessed the women with the practiced evaluation of someone who needed to know quickly whether new workers would help or hinder. Several ranch hands stood nearby. 2 men in their 60s who should have been retired but couldn't afford to stop working. 3 boys in their teens too young for military service but old enough for ranch labor. The absence of men in their 20s and 30s and 40s was obvious. Glaring, the war had carved a hole in the workforce that these German prisoners were supposed to fill. Frank spoke first. Auto-translated from English to German, his bilingual brain switching between languages with the ease of someone who had spent 45 years living in both simultaneously. "Any of you worked livestock before?" Greta's hand went up. The only one. Frank's assessment of her sharpened, nodded approval that felt earned rather than given. "Good. You'll help me with cattle. Rest of you will find your fit." Through Otto, Harrison and Frank explained the work. Some women would tend the large vegetable garden that fed the ranch household and supplied produce for town markets. Physical labor, but not as demanding as livestock work. Others would handle cattle, feeding, watering, general maintenance, moving animals between pastures. Still others would repair fences, a never-ending task on a ranch this size where cattle and weather constantly tested the wire. Katrine Schmidt, 26 and visibly pregnant, was assigned to garden duty. Light work appropriate for her condition. The consideration surprised her. She had expected to be worked until she collapsed or miscarried. Instead, the Americans were protecting her unborn child. The cognitive dissonance made her throat tight. Maggie was assigned to livestock crew along with 5 other women, including Anna and Greta. They were given work gloves, heavy leather worn soft by previous users, too large for women's hands but functional. The gloves had history written into them, stains from years of use, wear patterns that showed how other workers had gripped tools and rope, repairs where seams had split and been restitched rather than replaced. Greta touched the gloves with something like reverence. These had been worked by men before them. American men who had built this ranch and maintained it and left their marks on the leather. Now German women would add their marks, would become part of the ranch's history whether they intended to or not. Harrison demonstrated livestock work with the efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks 10,000 times. How to use a pitchfork to toss hay into feeding troughs without wasting it. How to pump water into metal tanks using the manual pumps that required rhythm and strength. How to move around cattle safely without startling them, approaching from angles they could see, speaking in low, calm voices that communicated intention without threat. Frank added details in his Spanish accented English that Otto translated into German. "Cattle aren't smart, but they remember kindness and remember cruelty. Treat them fair and they'll cooperate. Treat them rough and they'll make your work harder every single day." Maggie heard the unspoken parallel. The same logic applied to prisoners. Treat them fair, and they cooperate. Treat them rough, and they resist. Harrison and Frank were managing humans and cattle with the same basic philosophy. Respect produced better results than fear. The work began at 7 in the morning with the sun already fierce. The heat hit differently than German heat. Drier, more oppressive. Air so thick it felt solid in the lungs. Temperature climbing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and promising to stay there until evening brought marginal relief. Maggie's radio operator background had required mental focus but not muscle. Sitting for hours. Delicate finger work, adjusting frequencies and recording transmissions. Her body was unprepared for physical labor that demanded strength and endurance and tolerance for pain that accumulated with every hour. Lifting hay bales was the first shock, 40 to 50 pounds each, compressed grass bound with wire. She could lift one, could carry it 20 feet, could heave it into the feeding trough, then had to do it again, and again, and again. Dozens of bales, hundreds over the course of the morning. Her back started aching by 8:30, her arms trembled by 9, her hands blistered despite the leather gloves by 9:30. Anna struggled worse. Teacher's body completely unprepared for this. Shoveling manure made her gag. The smell was overwhelming. The physical act of lifting and throwing and spreading was humbling in ways that teaching children had never been. She had taught German superiority. Now she was shoveling American cow shit and wondering which reality was truer. Greta thrived. Farm girl strength made this work feel like coming home. She moved hay bales with ease, handled cattle with confidence born from years of experience, actually smiled while working, the first genuine smile Maggie had seen on her face since capture. But the smile carried guilt. Was it betrayal to love work on enemy land? Was it treason to feel more at home here than in the camps? By mid-morning, Maggie's entire body was screaming. Back on fire, hands raw, sweat soaking through the cotton dress, blisters forming on feet from donated shoes that didn't fit properly, dust coating her skin and hair and throat, thirst making her mouth feel packed with cotton. But she wasn't chained. The awareness returned constantly, surprising her each time. Every movement reminded her, reaching for hay, filling water tanks, walking freely across open pasture, checking fence lines. Normal work concerns instead of prisoner concerns. Pain from labor instead of pain from restraints. Freedom to move even though the movement hurt. The distinction mattered more than she had expected. Chains created one kind of suffering. Hard work created different suffering, but the second kind felt honest, felt earned, felt like something she was choosing even though choice was limited by circumstances beyond her control. Sensory details overwhelmed her operator's need to categorize and file information. The work became pure physical experience that defied analysis. Hay stabbed through her gloves. Pitchfork handle raised blisters on palms despite leather protection. Hay dust filled her nose and lungs, making her cough. The smell was sweet and dry and organic. Living grass compressed and dried and stored for animals that would convert it into milk and meat. Water hauling created different sensations. The pump handle was old metal worn smooth by decades of hands. It creaked with each stroke. Rhythmic sound like music, like a heartbeat. Metal on metal, speaking a mechanical language, about friction and force, and the persistence required to bring water from underground darkness into sunlight where living things could drink. Cold water gushed into metal tanks. Sun made rainbows in the spray. The sound was musical, rushing and splashing and overflowing. Water splashing on her hands was shockingly cold despite the heat. The contrast made her gasp. Her body remembered what cold felt like, remembered it existed, remembered that not everything in Texas was burning. The weight of full buckets pulled her arms from their sockets. 50 pounds of water in containers with wire handles that cut into palms. She carried them 20 yards, 30, 50, poured them into tanks for cattle that drank gallons daily, then walked back to the pump and repeated the process. Again, again, again. Cattle proximity created new awareness. These animals were massive, each one weighed over 1,000 pounds. Could kill her accidentally just by stepping wrong or swinging ahead too fast. She moved around them carefully, speaking in low German that they didn't understand but responded to anyway. Tone mattered more than language. Calm voices communicated safety, harsh voices communicated threat. The cattle taught her this without words. Frank Delgado noticed Greta's competence by mid-morning, approached her while she was spreading hay, moving around cattle, with the casual confidence of someone who had grown up doing this work. "You've done this before." Not a question. Statement. Recognition from one professional to another. Greta responded in halting English, her German accent thick, but her meaning clear. "Yes, my family farm. Bavaria, cattle, pigs, chickens." Frank nodded. "Shows. You move around animals, right? Respect them, but not fear them." He paused, studied her face, saw something there that made him ask the next question more gently. "Your family still farming?" Greta's voice broke. "Bombing. Letter says farm destroyed. Father killed. Mother sisters don't know." The grief was fresh, raw, the kind of pain that had no comfort except time, and even time didn't heal it completely, just made it bearable. Frank was silent for a long moment, then spoke words that weren't comfort, because comfort was impossible, but were acknowledgement that suffering mattered even when it couldn't be fixed. "I'm sorry. War takes too much from too many." Another pause. Then philosophy delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truth. "But land remembers those who work it. You work this land now, it'll remember you." Greta looked at the pasture spreading in every direction. Texas dirt under her feet instead of Bavarian soil. American cattle instead of German livestock. Enemy land instead of home. "But I'm prisoner." German. Enemy. Frank's response was simple, definitive. The kind of statement that created reality through assertion. "On this ranch, you're ranch hand. Enemy is somewhere else. Here you're just Greta who knows cattle." The words settled into her like seeds, finding soil, taking root, growing into possibility that yesterday hadn't existed. She was person first, ranch hand second, German third. Enemy only in context that didn't include this pasture, these cattle, this work. The transformation had begun in her chest, small, fragile, easily crushed if anyone pushed too hard, but real, present, growing with every hour she spent doing work that felt like home, even though home was destroyed and would never exist again in the form she remembered. Noon arrived with the sun directly overhead and temperature peaking at 105 degrees. Work stopped. Even cattle sought shade. The heat made continued labor dangerous. Humans needed rest, needed water, needed food and shelter from sun that was trying to kill everything that moved. Ruth Harrison appeared from the main house carrying wooden trays, 55 years old. Practical woman with kind eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. She had been watching the new workers all morning, had seen their struggle, had measured their effort, had decided they deserved to be fed like people who had earned their meals. The sandwiches came first, thick-cut bread that was homemade, still slightly warm from the oven. The smell alone was intoxicating. Yeast and grain and butter. Real roast beef between the slices, not rations or mystery meat, but actual beef from cattle raised on this ranch and butchered and prepared. Fresh lettuce and tomatoes from the garden these women would be tending. Butter spread generously instead of the thin scraping that made rations barely edible. Maggie took her sandwich with trembling hands. This was more food than she had received in a week as a prisoner. More quality, more quantity, more evidence that Americans either had resources beyond comprehension or were choosing to share resources they could have hoarded. Fresh fruit followed. Oranges that were luxury items in wartime. Apples kept cold somehow in cellars that used earth as natural refrigeration. Grapes sweet enough to make her teeth ache. Each piece of fruit was perfect, unblemished, chosen with care instead of thrown as charity. Then Ruth brought the lemonade. Large glass pitcher beaded with condensation. The sight alone made Maggie's throat constrict with thirst. Ice cubes visible through the glass impossibly clear, clinking gently against the sides with musical sound. Yellow liquid catching sunlight and glowing like something precious, like liquid gold. Like proof that sweetness still existed in a world that had forgotten how to be anything except bitter. The women ate in the shade of a massive live oak tree that had been providing shelter longer than any of them had been alive. Branches spreading like natural architecture. Leaves creating patterns of light and shadow that moved with the breeze. The temperature dropped 10 degrees under the canopy. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Ruth poured lemonade into tin cups. The sound of liquid filling metal was crisp, clean. The fizz of tiny bubbles releasing was audible in the quiet that came with people too exhausted and too focused on food to speak. Ice clinking against tin sounded like celebration, like luxury, like evidence of civilization persisting despite war. Maggie drank slowly, trying to make it last, trying to memorize every sensation. The cold shocked her mouth after hours of heat. Sweet sugar coated her tongue after weeks of bland rations. Tart citrus made her mouth water and her eyes water simultaneously. Ice against her lips was sensation she had forgotten existed. Hard and cold and melting into cold liquid that was somehow more refreshing than the liquid itself. The texture was complex, smooth flow coating her dry throat, pulp bits adding substance, ice chips crunching between teeth and releasing fresh cold. Every swallow was revelation. Every moment with the cup against her lips was proof that kindness existed in liquid form. The taste spoke of effort. Someone had squeezed lemons, had added sugar that was rationed in wartime, had made ice in a world where refrigeration was luxury, had brought it to prisoners in a field under oak trees, had served it with respect instead of contempt. This was kindness made liquid. This was proof that the world still contained sweetness even for German prisoners who deserved nothing except survival until the war ended and repatriation began. Anna cried quietly, silent tears running down her face that she wiped away quickly as if ashamed. But the tears kept coming, overwhelmed by simple dignity, by being served instead of commanded, by receiving more than minimum requirements, by treatment that suggested they mattered as humans instead of existing as problems to be managed. Greta was reminded of her mother's lemonade on harvest days. Same taste, different continent. The similarity was painful and comforting simultaneously. Home existed in flavor memory, in the way certain tastes could transport consciousness across oceans and years to moments when life made sense and family was intact and war was someone else's nightmare. Ruth's service manner was key to the transformation happening in 12 women's understanding of their circumstances. She didn't drop plates on the ground. She placed them in hands, made eye contact, smiled, asked in simple English if they wanted more, and when they hesitated out of disbelief, she filled their cups again without waiting for permission. When the first pitcher emptied, Ruth brought a second, unasked, simply appeared from the house with more lemonade because thirsty people working in 100-degree heat needed more than one serving. The gesture was casual, normal, the kind of thing anyone would do for workers they valued. She stayed to eat with them, sat on the grass instead of standing over them, ate the same food, drank the same lemonade, created community through proximity instead of maintaining distance that reinforced hierarchy. The guards sat nearby but didn't hover, ate their own lunches, smoked cigarettes, read newspapers, treated this like normal lunch break instead of security situation requiring vigilance. Their casual attitude communicated more than words could. These prisoners weren't threats, they were workers. The distinction mattered. Maggie hadn't thought about chains in 2 hours. The realization shocked her. She had thought about hay bales and water buckets and cattle and blisters and heat. Normal work concerns, problems that had solutions involving technique and endurance instead of submission and survival. The transformation was happening in small increments. Each hour without chains removed another layer of prisoner identity. Each task completed competently added another layer of worker identity. The balance was shifting from enemy, who must be contained, to person, who could be trusted with responsibility. But not everyone saw it that way. Sergeant William Barnes watched from his truck parked 50 yards away, watched Ruth Harrison serve lemonade to German prisoners, watched women smiling, watched guards relaxed and casual, watched the entire scene with growing conviction that Harrison's kindness was dangerous weakness. His notebook came out, his camera clicked, evidence accumulating, photographs of prisoners drinking lemonade, notes about guards fraternizing, documentation building toward report that would trigger investigation that would threaten everything. Barnes believed he was protecting America, protecting the memory of his brother who had died at Normandy, protecting the values that made strict chains on enemies necessary. He was wrong, but he was certain, and certain men with authority to file complaints could cause damage that took months to repair. The afternoon brought different challenges. Tom Rawlings, another aging ranch hand, showed the women how to repair fence line damaged by cattle testing the wire until it failed, how to stretch wire tight using fence stretchers that required two people working in coordination, how to hammer staples into wooden posts without splitting the wood, how to create repairs that would last years instead of weeks. The work was detailed, precise, required attention and skill instead of just muscle. Maggie's operator background helped. She understood mechanical systems, understood tension and force, and the physics of keeping things from falling apart. The fence repair became problem-solving instead of mindless labor. Tom spoke little, but his instructions were clear. He didn't care that they were German, didn't care about politics or ideology or whose side won the war. He cared whether they worked honestly and learned quickly. By those measures, he seemed satisfied with what he saw. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink and purple, in layers of color that seemed impossible, the women loaded back into the truck for return to Camp Hearn. Exhausted, sore, hands blistered and backs aching and feet bleeding in donated shoes that had created new wounds. But something had shifted. They had worked an honest day, had been treated fairly, had drunk cold lemonade under Texas sky, had been called by their names instead of their numbers. The chains were gone, and the world hadn't ended. They were still prisoners, still enemies, still German and American custody, but also workers who had value beyond their status as captured combatants. 3 weeks into the work, Harrison had a problem that would become Maggie's transformation. A cow died giving birth. The calf survived barely, all legs and huge dark eyes and breathing too fast. Without its mother, it would die within days unless someone bottle-fed it every few hours. The kind of commitment that required patience and attention and willingness to bond with something fragile. Harrison walked into the barn where Maggie was stacking hay with methodical precision that came from wanting to do the work correctly instead of just getting it done. He stood in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against afternoon light, considering his words before speaking them. "Miss Hoffman, I have a situation," Otto translated. Maggie turned pitchfork still in hand, hay dust coating her arms and face. "Needs someone with patience and attention to detail. Cow died giving birth this morning. Calf survived, but barely. Weak. Will die within days unless someone bottle feeds it every few hours." Harrison paused. Let the request settle before making it explicit. It's hard work. Night feedings. No guarantee of success. But if someone commits calf, has chance. Volunteer. Maggie's hand went up before her conscious mind made the decision. Instinct from somewhere deeper than thought. Radio operators need to solve problems. Or maybe just the need to create something instead of supporting systems designed for destruction. Anna and Greta watched with expressions Maggie couldn't read. Surprise, maybe, or recognition that their friend was changing in ways none of them could predict. Harrison led her to a barn stall where the calf lay in fresh straw, too weak to stand, gangly proportions that would become Grace if it survived long enough to grow into its own body. Eyes huge and dark and liquid, with something that might have been fear or might have been simple exhaustion from the effort of continuing to breathe. Maggie knelt in the straw. The calf smelled like hay and warmth and something indefinably alive. The smell of new life struggling to stay new. She touched its neck gently. The fur was soft over fragile bones. The heartbeat under her palm was too fast. Desperate rhythm of a body working too hard just to exist. Harrison showed her how to mix formula with the precision necessary for survival. Powdered milk measured exactly. Warm water, not hot, tested on the wrist the way mothers tested milk for human babies. The comparison wasn't lost on Maggie. She was being taught motherhood through proxy, being trusted with life that depended entirely on her competence. "They're stubborn at first," Harrison said through Otto. "Don't understand rubber nipple isn't their mother. But once they learn, they'll remember you. You'll be its mother now." The responsibility settled onto her shoulders like weight, like purpose, like something she hadn't known she needed until it was offered. Maggie touched the calf again, murmured soft German words unconsciously. "Kleiner, Kleiner, es ist gut, ich bin hier. Little one, it's okay, I'm here." She didn't realize she was speaking German, didn't realize she sounded like a mother comforting a child, didn't realize that Harrison was watching with satisfaction, seeing exactly what he had hoped to see. Someone capable of caring when caring seemed impossible. The first feeding attempt was struggle. She guided the bottle toward the calf's mouth. It resisted, turned its head, confused by a strange rubber thing that wasn't its mother, looking for what it knew, what it needed, what it expected to find and couldn't. Maggie persisted, patient, gentle pressure, murmuring constantly in German that the calf didn't understand but responded to anyway. Tone mattered more than language. Calm voices communicated safety even when words were foreign. Then breakthrough came. The calf latched on, started sucking desperately. Milk disappeared from the bottle. Its tail twitched with satisfaction. Its entire body relaxed as it fed, trusting this stranger completely because hunger made trust necessary. Something cracked open in Maggie's chest. Not broke. Opened. Made space for feelings she hadn't allowed herself in years. She had never been maternal. Never particularly liked children or animals. Never imagined herself as caretaker for anything beyond radio equipment that couldn't love her back. But this calf needed her. Its survival depended on her patience, her attention, her willingness to return every few hours with a bottle. And the calf didn't care that she was German. Didn't care about war or uniforms or enemy status. Just knew she brought food and warmth and safety. When the bottle emptied, the calf looked at her with eyes that held only gratitude. Pure, uncomplicated. The kind of relationship that existed before politics and nationality and war made relationships complicated. Harrison watched from the barn entrance. That calf won't forget you. You're its person now. Maggie nodded, couldn't trust her voice, couldn't explain the feeling spreading through her chest like warmth, like light, like proof that she could create life instead of supporting systems designed for death. The feeding schedule was established. 6 in the morning before work, noon during lunch break, 6 in the evening after work, 10 at night before sleep. Guards would escort her for night feedings because security required it, even though trust was growing. But the calf was hers, her responsibility, her project, her proof that she was more than just prisoner and operator, an enemy. She was someone capable of keeping fragile life alive through patience and care. The transformation accelerated from that moment. Radio operator to ranch hand to mother of sorts. German to worker to person who mattered because a calf needed her specifically. She fed it 4 times daily for 2 weeks. Watched it grow stronger. Watched it stand on wobbly legs. Watched it run clumsily around the corral. Each feeding session felt like victory, like evidence that she could nurture instead of destroy. And somewhere in those 2 weeks between the morning feedings and the evening care and the night trips to the barn, with bored guards who stopped watching her closely because she always came back, Maggie Hoffman stopped being just a prisoner. She became someone's person, someone's mother, someone who mattered not because of what she had done in the war, but because of what she was doing now. The chains had fallen from her wrists 3 weeks ago. Now they were falling from her understanding of who she could become. The calf thrived under Maggie's care, growing stronger each day until it no longer needed the bottle. But the transformation the animal had sparked in Maggie continued growing in ways neither she nor Harrison had anticipated. The radio operator from Berlin was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood cattle and fences and the rhythm of ranch life that measured time in seasons instead of battles. Harrison noticed. Watched her move around livestock with increasing confidence. Watched her repair equipment with the precision that came from understanding how systems worked. Watched her interact with the land as if she belonged there. One afternoon in late July, he made a decision that would complete her transformation. The ranch needed to move cattle between pastures. His regular hands were occupied with other tasks. He looked at Maggie, at her competence with animals, at the way she had learned to read their moods and movements. "You ever ride a horse?" The question came through Otto's translation. Maggie looked up from the fence she was repairing, surprised by the direction this conversation was taking. "No," she admitted, "never." Harrison studied her for a long moment, measuring something she couldn't identify, then nodded as if making a decision that involved risk but was worth taking. "Want to learn?" The answer came without hesitation. Yes. Desperately yes. Learning to ride meant trust. Meant Harrison believed she could handle responsibility that went beyond manual labor. Meant transformation from prisoner, who needed watching, to worker, who could be given freedom and authority. He started her on an old mare named Patience. The name was prophetic. The horse had weathered decades of inexperienced riders and remained calm through mistakes that would have made younger horses bolt. Maggie approached the animal with the same careful respect she had learned to show cattle, speaking softly in German, moving slowly, letting Patience see her and smell her and decide whether this new human could be trusted. Harrison showed her how to mount, how to sit balanced in the saddle with weight distributed properly, how to hold the reins loosely communicating through subtle pressure instead of force, how to shift weight to signal direction. The instructions were simple, but the execution required practice and patience from both horse and rider. The first ride terrified and thrilled her equally. The height put her 10 feet above ground. The movement of living muscle beneath her was power she could feel but not control completely. Patience could choose to cooperate or rebel, could throw her or run or simply refuse to move. The relationship required mutual consent that no chain could create. Maggie held the reins with trembling hands, felt the horse respond to pressure so light it was barely contact, felt the communication happening through touch and weight and breath. This was partnership instead of domination, trust instead of force. The lesson extended beyond horsemanship into philosophy about how humans could relate to each other. By the third lesson, she could walk Patience confidently around the corral. By the fifth, she could trot without panic, her body learning the rhythm, her muscles adapting to the motion. By the 10th lesson, Harrison trusted her enough to help move small groups of cattle between pastures. Real work that freed his experienced hands for harder tasks. The transformation was complete in ways that still surprised her. Margaret Hoffman, radio operator from Berlin, had become a cowgirl in Texas. She knew the ranch's geography now. Every pasture, every water source, every gate and fence line. She could read weather in cloud formations and wind direction. Could judge time by sun position instead of clocks. Could move cattle with whistles and positioning instead of force. Her body had changed too. Muscles developed in her arms and shoulders and legs. Her hands grew calloused in new patterns that spoke of rope and reins instead of radio dials. Her skin darkened from constant sun. She became stronger than she had ever been, became someone she wouldn't have recognized 3 months ago. Frank Delgado noticed the transformation. One afternoon while they worked together repairing a windmill, he spoke words that would echo in her memory for decades. "You got a natural feel for this work. Most city folks never develop it." Maggie paused in her work, considering how to respond. "Berlin is very different from here." Frank nodded, his weathered face creasing with understanding that went deeper than the surface conversation. "War's a strange thing. Takes people from where they belong and drops them somewhere unexpected. Sometimes they find they belong in the new place better than the old." The words settled into her like seeds finding soil. She thought about them that night in her bunk, thought about the calf that knew her voice, the horse that responded to her commands, the fences she had repaired that would stand for years, the work that left her exhausted but satisfied in ways that radio operation never had. She was still a prisoner, still wore that identity in official documents and guard protocols, but she was also someone's person, someone capable, someone who mattered. The chains were gone from her wrists. She could feel them lifting from her mind too. September arrived with marginally cooler temperatures and news that changed everything. Germany was losing badly. The Allies were advancing from all sides. The war would end soon. Maybe months. Maybe a year. Prisoners would eventually be repatriated, sent home to whatever remained of their countries after years of destruction. Harrison gathered all 12 women in the barn on a Saturday afternoon in late September. The air smelled of hay and leather and the lingering warmth of the day. Golden light slanted through gaps in the wood, creating patterns on the floor that shifted as the sun moved. Otto stood ready to translate. The women gathered in a semicircle, sensing this meeting carried weight beyond routine announcements. Harrison removed his hat, held it in weathered hands that had built this ranch and sustained it through droughts and economic depressions and now war. He looked at each woman in turn. Direct eye contact that communicated respect instead of dominance. "You folks have worked here for months now. Good, honest work." He paused, letting the acknowledgement settle before continuing. "Some of you," he nodded at Maggie, "have become genuinely skilled at ranch tasks most city people never learn. When you first arrived, chained, looking scared and worn down, I wasn't sure this would work. Wasn't sure prisoners could be trusted without constant watching. Wasn't sure Germans would take direction from Americans. Wasn't sure about a lot of things. His voice carried the honesty of someone who had questioned his own decisions and found answers through experience instead of theory. But you proved something important. You proved that people are people regardless of which side of a war they're on. You proved that given decent treatment and real work, most folks respond with decent effort. You proved that chains and fear aren't necessary. Just respect and fair dealing. Otto's translation carried the weight of the English words into German. Several women's eyes filled with tears at the simple acknowledgement that their effort had been seen and valued. The war will end. You'll go home to Germany. What you'll find there, I don't know. Probably hardship, probably destruction, probably years of rebuilding. His voice softened with something that might have been compassion or might have been recognition of suffering he couldn't prevent. But I want you to remember something. You're not prisoners first. You're not Germans first. You're people first. People with skills and worth and dignity that exist no matter what nations do, no matter who wins wars, no matter what. He looked directly at Maggie, his gaze holding weight that made her chest tighten. You became a cowgirl in Texas. That wasn't in any plan you made for your life. But you did it, became excellent at it. That's who you are. Someone capable of learning hard things, adapting to impossible situations, doing difficult work with skill and grace. Otto's voice wavered slightly, translating those last words. The compliment was so unexpected, so genuine, that several women openly cried. Anna's tears fell without shame now. Greta wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Katrine, her pregnancy now obvious, placed a hand on her belly, as if wanting her unborn child to somehow remember this moment of being valued. When you go home, don't let anyone reduce you to just a nationality or just an enemy or just whatever category they want. You're more than categories, you're individuals. Remember that. The barn was silent except for the sound of breathing and distant cattle and wind moving through gaps in the wood. The moment held weight that would carry forward into futures none of them could predict. Harrison gave each woman a parting gift. Work gloves, leather-worn, soft but functional, and a handwritten note expressing gratitude for their labor. Maggie's note included an extra line in Harrison's careful handwriting that made her hands shake as she read it. You're welcome back if you ever want to visit. A cowgirl always has a place on this ranch. She folded the note carefully, placed it in her pocket next to a photograph of her parents taken before the war, turned the world into something unrecognizable. Two pieces of paper representing two different possibilities of home. That evening back at Camp Hearn, the women processed what Harrison's speech meant. The certainty of repatriation. The uncertainty of what they would find when they returned. The knowledge that this Texas ranch had become something more than a work assignment. Anna asked the question that all of them were thinking. What do you think he meant? People first. Maggie was silent for a long moment, searching for words that could capture the transformation that had happened over 4 months of unchained work. He meant the chains were never necessary. He meant we were always people, even when others saw us as threats. He meant who we are matters more than what side we fought on. Do you believe that Greta's voice carried hope and doubt in equal measure? I do now, Maggie said. I didn't when we arrived, but I do now. Around them, other women nodded slowly. Harrison had removed their chains on the first day, but today he had told them why, had articulated the philosophy that made the removal necessary instead of charitable, had given them language to understand their own worth independent of circumstances that had reduced them to prisoners. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The news reached Camp Hearn through official channels, spreading through the barracks in waves of reactions that ranged from relief to devastation to numbness. The war in Europe had ended. The killing would stop. The destruction would pause. But what came next carried its own terrors. Maggie felt strangely disconnected from the announcement. The war had been happening somewhere else for months, a distant abstraction while she fed calves and rode horses and repaired fences in Texas. Its end changed nothing immediately. She was still a prisoner, still working Harrison Ranch. The surrender was theoretically significant, but practically altered little in her daily life. But gradually changes accumulated. Talk of repatriation began, processing schedules, transportation arrangements, The massive bureaucratic effort required to return millions of displaced persons and prisoners to homelands that had been transformed by defeat and occupation. Maggie was repatriated in August 1945. The journey reversed her arrival, trucks to trains to ships across the Atlantic. But this time, no chains bound her wrists. No armed guards treated her like a threat requiring constant vigilance. Just exhausted people heading toward uncertain futures, carrying memories of places where they had been treated better than they expected. The final goodbye at Harrison Ranch happened on a morning that felt too normal for something so significant. The 12 women gathered one last time in the yard where they had first arrived unchained. Harrison and Ruth stood beside Frank and Otto. Even Sergeant Barnes was there, transformed from antagonist to ally over months of watching prisoners prove his assumptions wrong. Barnes approached Maggie privately before she left. His face carried the weight of someone who had learned hard lessons about the cost of hatred. "Thank you for teaching me something about humanity," he said through Otto's translation. "My brother would be proud I learned this." Maggie didn't know how to respond to that, settled for a nod that acknowledged his growth without claiming credit for it. Harrison's private moment with her came last. He walked her to the truck that would carry her away from this place that had become more than a work assignment. "Maggie, I can sponsor your immigration. After things settle, you could come back. Work here permanently." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting beyond measure. A chance to stay in a place where she had discovered who she could become. A chance to avoid whatever waited in Germany. But her answer came from somewhere deeper than self-interest. "Mr. Harrison, that's incredibly generous. But Germany needs people who know how to rebuild, people who learned about dignity and hard work. I need to go home to help rebuild what was destroyed." Harrison nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had expected exactly that answer. "That's the cowgirl talking, doing the hard thing because it's right." He handed her an envelope. "Letters of reference, skills documentation, in case you need work, and this." He gave her a photograph. Maggie on horseback, squinting at camera in bright Texas sun, wearing work clothes and a slight smile. On the back, in Harrison's handwriting, Margaret Hoffman, cowgirl, August 1945. "Proof that people are people first, everything else second." She clutched the photograph like proof of transformation. Like evidence that the past 4 months had been real and not fever dream, invented by a desperate mind seeking hope in hopeless circumstances. The truck pulled away. Maggie watched Harrison Ranch disappear in dust clouds behind them. Watched the windmills shrink to dots on the horizon. Watched Texas fade into memory that would sustain her through what came next. Hamburg was barely recognizable when she arrived, where a city had stood rubble stretched for miles. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames. Streets buried under debris. The smell of dust and death still lingering months after the bombing stopped. Germany had been destroyed more thoroughly than her worst nightmares had predicted. From Hamburg, she made her way to Berlin through broken transport systems and zones controlled by different Allied powers. Checkpoints required endless paperwork. Identity had to be proven repeatedly to authorities who viewed all Germans with suspicion that ranged from administrative to hostile. Berlin was worse than Hamburg. The city center was a moonscape. Her family's apartment building had been hit by bombs reduced to twisted steel and concrete fragments that bore no resemblance to the home she remembered. Neighbors who survived told her the news she had been dreading since repatriation began. Her parents were dead, killed in an air raid in February 1945, buried in a mass grave with hundreds of others. No individual markers, no ceremony, just bodies cleared from streets and placed in holes dug by the living who were too exhausted to mourn properly. Maggie was alone, completely alone, 24 years old in a destroyed city without family or home or prospects. Around her, millions of other Germans navigated similar devastation. Loss and defeat, and the grinding work of survival in circumstances that made survival seem impossible. But Maggie had something many others didn't. She had memories of Texas. She had skills learned on Harrison Ranch. She had knowledge that was radical and sustaining, that people were people first, that dignity existed independent of national catastrophes, that chains could be removed by anyone willing to say, "You don't need these here." She found work in reconstruction, physical laborer like the ranch, hauling rubble, clearing streets, the endless work of transforming ruins back into a functioning city. The work was brutal, but Maggie was strong now. Her hands were calloused. Her back was resilient. She could work full days without breaking. Ranch training made her valuable when strength and endurance were the only currencies that mattered. She found Anna purely by chance in a bread line in the American sector 3 months after returning. They recognized each other instantly across the crowd of anonymous faces, embraced with emotion that surprised them both. Talked 4 hours sharing stories of return and what they had found and lost. "Do you think about Texas?" Anna asked. "Every day," Maggie admitted. "Me too. About Harrison, about the moment the chains came off, about being treated like people instead of enemies." Greta appeared later working as a crew foreman in reconstruction office, using ranch management skills to organize labor crews. Her family was gone, farm destroyed, parents dead. But she was rebuilding Germany with the same determination she had repaired fences. The same philosophy that Harrison had taught through example instead of lectures. "Harrison taught us people are people first," Greta said. When the three of them gathered in a cafe that served ersatz coffee and stale bread, but provided warmth and community. Germany needs people who remember that. The three women became anchors for each other in a city that offered little except hardship. They shared memories of lemonade and cattle and Texas sky that went on forever. Shared the knowledge that somewhere in the world during the worst war in human history, they had been treated with dignity by people who could have chosen cruelty. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, a letter arrived from Texas. Maggie recognized the handwriting immediately. Sam Harrison, now 79, writing to say he had often wondered what became of the German women who had worked his ranch. Hoped they had survived. Hoped they had found peace. Maggie wrote back immediately, described her life in Berlin, her work helping rebuild the city, her survival against odds that had seemed impossible, thanked him for treatment that had been humane when humanity seemed absent, for removing chains when protocol said they were necessary, for insisting she was a person first. Harrison's reply was brief but powerful, words that carried the same directness he had spoken 20 years earlier. That wasn't generosity. That was just decency. You worked hard, deserved respect. The chains were always wrong, wrong practically, wrong morally. I'm glad it meant something. Glad you survived. They exchanged letters sporadically over the years. Short updates, occasional news, a connection maintained across oceans and decades. Proof that what had happened in 1944 mattered beyond the immediate circumstances that created it. Harrison died in 1972 at age 86. His daughter sent Maggie a copy of his obituary, along with a note that made tears stream down her face as she read it. Dad spoke often of the German women who worked the ranch during the war. Said you taught him something important about human nature. Thank you. Maggie kept the letter, kept the worn work gloves Harrison had given her in 1945, kept the memory of chains falling away, of a rancher saying you won't need these here, of proof that dignity was possible even in circumstances designed to dehumanize. She lived until 1998, dying at 77 in a Berlin transformed from ruins to prosperity. She had witnessed Germany's division and reunification, had contributed to its rebuilding, had survived when survival seemed impossible, had lived long enough to see her country become something different than the Reich that had trained her to intercept enemy transmissions. In her possessions, her nieces found the gloves and letters and one photograph she had never mentioned. Herself on horseback in Texas, squinting at camera in bright sun, wearing work clothes and a slight smile. On the back, in Harrison's handwriting, Margaret Hoffman Dahlgirl, June 1945. Proof that people are people first, everything else second. The nieces had never known their aunt was a prisoner of war, never knew she worked a Texas ranch, never knew she became a cowgirl. Reading the letters and studying the photograph, they began to understand what had shaped her. Why she always treated people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Why she kept worn work gloves for 53 years. Why she had rebuilt Germany with the same patience she had learned bottle-feeding calves. The chains had defined her capture. Their removal had defined her transformation. The memory of their absence had defined her life. This is what happened when German women arrived in Texas in chains. Cowboys removed them. Not because security changed, not because the women were harmless, but because someone decided chains weren't necessary for people doing honest work. That decision didn't change the war, didn't alter history's grand sweep, but it changed Maggie, changed Anna and Greta and Katrine and the others who worked Harrison Ranch. It taught them that humanity persisted even in war, that individuals could transcend national categories, that chains were removable by anyone willing to offer dignity instead of fear. The war ended, the prisoners returned, Germany rebuilt, but the memory remained of chains falling away, of a Texas rancher saying your people first, of proof that even enemies could be treated with decency. In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombs or armies. It was this, the radical act of removing chains and trusting people to be people. 5 words that changed lives. 5 words that proved humanity was stronger than war. You won't need these here. Texas, 1944. A group of German women prisoners stood in scorching heat. Their wrists were red and raw, chained for 3 long weeks. They had crossed an ocean expecting torture, expecting starvation, expecting the worst. But then a cowboy walked toward them. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying bolt cutters. He looked at their chains, looked at their frightened faces. Then he said something that made every woman freeze in shock. 5 simple words, words that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. You won't need these here. The chains hit the ground. The women couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't believe what just happened. These German prisoners, enemies of America, were about to experience something that would destroy everything they believed about Americans. Something that would change their lives forever. This wasn't propaganda. This was real. This story has been hidden for decades. Margaret Hoffman carried that photograph until the day she died. Carried the memory of transformation from chained prisoner to skilled worker to someone who mattered. Carried the knowledge that had sustained her through years of reconstruction and loss and the hard work of building a life from ruins. People are people first. Everything else is context. The chains fell in a Texas administrative building in June 1944, but their echo carried forward through 77 years of one woman's life, through the lives of 11 other women who learned the same lesson, through the example they set for how humans could treat each other, even in circumstances designed to make treatment irrelevant. Sam Harrison didn't set out to change the world. He set out to solve a labor shortage on his ranch. But in solving that practical problem with dignity instead of degradation, he proved something that war tried to disprove. That kindness produced better results than cruelty. That respect earned cooperation that force never could. That chains were never necessary for people willing to work honestly. The lesson echoes still. In a world that keeps finding new reasons to chain people, new categories to sort humans into us and them, new justifications for treating enemies as less than human. The chains are still falling. Someone just has to be willing to say those 5 words. To bet on dignity instead of degradation. To trust that people are people first, regardless of uniforms or nationality, or which side of a conflict they represent. You won't need these here. 5 words, infinite implications. 1 Texas ranch, 12 German women. Proof that humanity survives even when everything else burns. The photograph remains, faded now, creased from decades of handling, but still showing a young woman on horseback in Texas, sun smiling, slightly transformed from prisoner to person by someone willing to remove chains and trust what remained. People first, prisoners second. The order matters. The priority changes everything. Remember that.